Hello and welcome to the eOrganic webinar on the newly released Organic Pasture Rule presented by Dr. Kerry Smith of the USDA AMS National Organic Program. This webinar was originally broadcast on March 17, 2010. My name is Deb Haliba and I work at the University of Vermont Extension as eOrganic's Dairy Team Coordinator. eOrganic is an online community of more than 600 ag service providers and farmers who are providing science, experience, and regulation-based certified organic information on the web. With funding from the USDA Integrated Organic Program, we publish articles, videos, and other content at eextension.org. In this recording of the webinar, Dr. Kerry Smith gives an overview of the Access to Pasture proposed rule, which was recently revised by the National Organic Program. Kerry is a livestock and meat marketing specialist with the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service. She received her Master of Science degree from the University of Florida and her doctorate from the University of Georgia, both in animal science, with an emphasis on meat science and muscle biology. Dr. Smith is currently working with the National Organic Program to coordinate the rollout and implementation of the new Pasture Rule. To learn more about the Pasture Rule, please visit the website of the National Organic Program at www.ams.usda.gov/NOP. Look for the Pasture Rulemaking Information tab on the right-hand side of the screen.
Good afternoon. First, I want to say that the National Organic Program is excited to join with eOrganics and present this webinar. I will say this will be the first official webinar that I have given. I've participated in them and listened, but it's a little different for me not actually getting to see my audience and kind of respond to how they're accepting it. But I will say at least I have fellow NOP staff members here with me, so at least I won't feel like I'm sitting in a room talking to myself. So I hope everybody can hear me, and we will go ahead and get started with this. Now, I also want to prompt this and say, I apologize now if this seems quite rushed, because it's a lot of information with this rule to get through in 45 minutes time. So hopefully you will get everything, your questions answered with this, but if not, we do have plenty of other resources that are out there across the country, as well as you can come straight to the program with questions that you're concerned with. But we are here today to talk about the access to pasture, and this is, of course, the final rule, and it has a request for comment. That is something that's very unusual when it comes to a final rule. We will get to the request for comment section a little later. Okay. What was the intent of this rule? This rule was intended to, hold on, I'm having technical difficulties. Like I say, this is my first one. Oh, wait. Okay, there we go. Sorry. I wasn't sure how to close that away. All right, what is the intent of this rule? Well, first, of course, is to reassure consumers that organic meat and milk comes from organically raised animals that are actively grazing on pasture during the grazing season. And with this, particularly, everyone was calling for specific measures to be in the rule so that it will ultimately enforce the integrity of the organic seal, especially with regards, of course, to livestock feed and living conditions. Not moving very fast. Sometimes it's sensitive and it'll move fast, and then other times it won't move at all. Okay. Yes, for some reason, I may have to turn it back over because for some reason it's not wanting to move with me very fast. This is all the technicality that you learn as you do these. Okay, first of all, I want to give a real quick snapshot as to what are the main amendments that occurred with this rule. The first thing that I want to talk about is that, yes, this, of course, pertains to livestock. And the one key thing to remember is that while the majority of this rule pertains to ruminant livestock, there are certain clarifications and specifications to the rule that pertain to all livestock. So that's kind of the first bullet there, that there are some specific things that will apply to them all, and I'll make sure today I've divided it up into those two sections. But the other main thing is that this rule establishes a pasture practice standard for ruminant animals, and it recognizes pasture as a crop. Okay. Other main provisions: producers must provide year-round access for all animals to the outdoors. They must establish a functioning management plan for pasture, and they must incorporate that management plan for pasture into the organic systems plan. Producers must also provide ruminants with pasture throughout the grazing season for their particular geographic location, and they must ensure that ruminants derive not less than an average of 30% of their dry matter intake from pasture grazed over the grazing season. And right here we have in parentheses at least 120 days. We'll get into specifics with that much later. Now, I did want to bring up some things really quick as to what was not included into the rule that you may have seen in the proposed rule. So some of the proposed requirements that were deleted was the fencing of water bodies, providing of water at all times, indoors and outdoors, and the requirement for sacrificial pasture. Now, in particular, with the origin of livestock section, this will be addressed. However, the NOP chose not to address it with this rule, and will do a separate rulemaking for the origin of livestock. Okay. Now, probably one of the biggest confusions out there with regards to this rule is actually when does it be effective? You know, when will operations be held accountable for this new rule? The rule becomes effective June 17th of this year and must be fully implemented by June 17th of 2011. Operations which obtain organic certification by the effective date must comply with this final rule. And that's essentially any new operations. And then operations which are certified as of the publication date, which of course was February 17th, must be fully implemented 1 year from the effective date, which is June 17th, 2011. Now, as I stated, it's kind of in two different situations. I know this is confusing to a lot of people. So essentially, existing operations that were certified prior to the publication date, they have a year, the long implementation time, to have this in place. But beginning at the effective date, certifying agents should begin evaluating each producer for their compliance to the Pasture Rule and issue any non-compliances. However, after the rule is effective, all those non-compliances must have been addressed prior to the full implementation date. Okay. Now, new operations seeking certification, if they were not certified, an operation was not certified prior to the publication date, that means they are trying to seek certification right after it came out. They have a very short time to implement this. They have until the effective date. And after the effective date, for new operations, certifying agents should begin adverse action process if they are not in full compliance. Okay, here's kind of a little timeline event just to show you what we mean there. Essentially, you can see all the way from publication date to June 17th to 2011, any existing operation that has been certified prior to publication has that long time to become implemented. Okay, again, after here, they need to start having everything in the organic systems plan, and they will be evaluated by the certifying agent. However, adverse actions will not begin until after the implementation date. Now, new programs, as we said, is very different. They have this very small window of opportunity to come into compliance. So as soon as the effective date comes this year, they have to be compliant. As I said before, I split this presentation into two things. First, we're going to cover all of the issues that apply to all livestock. And then, of course, we'll get into the heart of this rule, which is the part that applies to the ruminants. Okay, some of the specific clarifications that were put into the rule that pertain to all is that all agriculture ingredients included in the ingredients list for additives and supplements must be organically produced and handled. Another clarification is with ionophores. Of course, antibiotics have always been prohibited, but now the rule specifically states ionophores. Okay. Another general area is with livestock living conditions. You know, the rule states the producer of organic operation must establish and maintain year-round livestock living conditions that accommodate the health and natural behavior of the animals. Well, one clarification to the rule is specifically with regard to access to the outdoors. It now states that, of course, they have to have year-round access to the outdoors. And the other main revision to this provision in the rule is clean water. The rule now allows yards, feeding pads, and feedlots to be used to provide ruminants access to the outdoors during non-grazing season, and then during the grazing season, these can be used to provide supplemental feeding. Now, yards, feeding pads, and feedlots do need to be large enough to allow them to move around without crowding or without competition of food. The rule does now specifically state that continuous total confinement of any animals indoors is prohibited, and continuous and total confinement of ruminants in yards, feeding pads, and feedlots is prohibited. Another general provision that was altered regards dry bedding. Roughages used as bedding shall be organically produced by a certified operation. Some of the other livestock living conditions provisions that were amended deal with some of the exceptions. So, in particular, animals may be provided temporary confinement or shelter for one, inclement weather. And inclement weather was also, the definition was changed. Normally I like to provide the definition into the presentation, but you can go into the rule and find that. But specifically, inclement weather says that weather that is violent or characterized by high or low temperatures or is characterized by excessive precipitation that may cause physical harm to any given species of livestock. So that is one reason why animals can be temporarily confined. Another issue is the animal's stage of life. Now, stage of life in the rule is defined as a discrete time period in an animal's life which requires specific management practice different than occurring in other periods of its life. Now, one of the issues with this stage of life is not so much the definition of stage of life, but more what is not considered a stage of life. Because this part was to edit, really, instead of using stage of production, because there was a lot of concern out there for people using stage of production as a means to temporarily confine. So this is to clarify that and to clarify that certain stages of production are not allowed to be used for temporary confinement. One of which you can see here directly in the rule is lactation is not a stage of life. That is a stage of production, and it cannot be used as a means to temporarily confine animals. Okay, but one other key thing with the stage of life, to be able to use stage of life as a temporary confinement exemption, you have to combine it really with one of the next two reasons for temporary confinement, one of which is conditions under which the health, safety, or well-being of the animal is jeopardized. The next is number 4, which hopefully will be coming on the screen. There we go. Or excuse me, not number 4, not that one yet, but risk to soil or water quality is another reason for temporary confinement or shelter. But number 5 can also be used with the stage of life, preventative health care procedures, or for a treatment of illness or injury. Okay. Sorting for shipping animals and livestock sales, breeding, and youth projects are also living conditions in which temporary confinement can be done. Now, there is also under the livestock living conditions, there is a section for temporarily denying ruminants pasture or access to the outdoors, one of which is 1 week at the end of lactation for dry off, 3 weeks prior to parturition and during parturition, and then 1 week after birth. And in the case of the newborn dairy calves, they are temporarily denied due to up to 6 months. With regard to fiber-bearing animals for short periods of time, and of course, dairy animals for short periods of time daily will have to come off pasture and be milked. But again, that's for a very short period of time during the day, and they still have to meet all the other requirements within the rule. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and jump on into the main part of this rule, which deals with the ruminant livestock. Okay, from here on out, you're going to hear us discussing the grazing season. Essentially, this rule is centered around ruminant animals being out on pasture during the grazing season. Now, one thing that you will probably notice a difference between the proposed rule and this new rule is the difference of growing season versus grazing season. And one thing I want to quickly tell you about right here is we do have a document out on the website that is a comparison, a side-by-side comparison of the original rule, the proposed rule, and the final rule. And that to me is one of the most helpful documents out there in helping you understand exactly what has changed with this rule. And in there, of course, you'll see a side-by-side comparison of going from growing season in the proposed rule to grazing season in this final rule. The reason for that is the growing season is a very prescriptive time frame. It's last frost to first frost, specific period of time. And essentially, during that period of time, there may not actually be really available forage. So it was changed to grazing season to allow more flexibility. And as you see here in the big star, it's all about availability. So that was the availability of forages is why it was moved, the term was moved to grazing season. Okay, the specific definition of grazing season is the period of time when pasture is available for grazing. And of course, this is due to natural precipitation or irrigation. Grazing season dates may vary because of different kind of weather events, and they may be extended by the grazing of residual forage as agreed upon in the OSP. But due to different weather events that can occur, the grazing season does not have to be continuous. And the grazing season also, you see most people saying at least 120 days. But you have to remember and look at this definition of grazing season in this rule and realize that that's not the max, or you don't have to just meet that. It is either from 120 days to up to 365 days, but it cannot be less than 120 days. So some people have been getting this confused, thinking they only had to reach the 120 day and that was it. Remember, grazing season is for the geographic location and is for the individual operations area. Okay, I wanted to give you a graph here to show you grazing season, what we mean by it not being continuous. Again, here, don't pay attention to the numbers. The numbers aren't a big deal. You know, it's just showing you an illustration here of how you can have a drop occur in your pastures and why your pastures would not be, your grazing season would not be considered continuous. So again, here you have in the spring, going into the summer, you have ample forage, and I think it says 92 days there. It looks like it's a little adjusted on the screen. But you have it for, 92 days, and all of a sudden you have this really heat period of time, but more importantly, you have a drought period of time. that's going to cause the availability of pasture to really drop off. So it's during this drop-off time that you can consider the time non-continuous. But you have 92 days over here, and after this drought comes out, you can come over here and have another 138 days and have a total of 230 days grazing season. Again, this is a completely hypothetical example, but, and there can be different variations of this, but this is just to show you an example of how it can be disruptive during the middle of the grazing season. But ultimately, you're still going to be okay because the number of days of grazing season is fine. Okay, now we're really jumping into the heart of all the provisions with regards to pasture. So we're just defining grazing season there, but the first provision is that producers cannot provide more than an average of 70% of the ruminant's dry matter demand from dry matter fed. So in other words, from feed, anything that is fed to them versus graze. So that cannot be more than 70% of their diet, of their dry matter demand. Okay, one thing I wanted to go into here is dry matter. Again, it's just going into that. It's what is fed, not what is grazed. And I'll get into these definitions in a minute. First, I'm going to go on to residual forage and bring up something here. This is also a clarification issue. All right, the NOP definition for residual forage is forage that is cut and left to lie or windrown and left to lie in place in a pasture. So in other words, cut and dropped. Okay, that's how it's defined in this definition. However, in terms of pasture management, you're going to hear a lot of grazing specialists, anybody that's involved in pasture management, they're going to use that term in a completely different way. And it's actually about, you don't want to consume the residual forage. Because residual forage in terms of pasture management means residual vegetation. It's the amount of forage that is remaining after grazing. And this is very important because you do want a residual forage left on each individual plant because that's a critical measure for the plant's health. And it basically protects it and then allows it to be able to come back and continue producing forage. So it's definitely a key thing there. Residual forage in terms of how it's defined with NOP in this rule is not a very prominent scenario. But you will hear people in pasture management use the term residual forage. So just make sure that you and the person, whomever you're talking to, if you hear them say that word, that you're both on the same page. Okay, and here's just a picture of this. You can see here's the ungrazed forage. Then after it's grazed, this is the residual portion left. And then because there is this residual, it can have this recovery and continue to grow, and it's all because of the metabolic reserve. But here, if you go down here and you graze it, but you overgraze it, then there's not enough left of the metabolic reserve for it to come back. And so ultimately it ends in death of the plant. So this is just an illustration of what we mean here. So again, just make sure you know which residual forage definition you're talking about. Okay, now on to the second provision, and actually this is the second and third provision within livestock feed. First one, of course, is that you can't provide more than 70% of the animal's dry matter intake from feed, and the next one is that you have to provide pasture of sufficient quality and quantity to graze. Now, notice this "and" mark. Okay, so that's important there. You have to provide sufficient quality and quantity to graze, and you cannot and you must provide 30% of the animal's dry matter intake from grazing. And of course here we're discussing what during the grazing season. The next slide, when it comes up, yes, is going to be our definition. Okay, dry matter demand. You know, a lot of people are getting confused between what do these two different terms mean. Essentially, dry matter demand is the expected dry matter intake, so the prediction of what they're going to be intaking. And then the dry matter intake is the total pounds of all feed devoid of moisture consumed. And we'll get into the specifics with that in much more detail later. Unfortunately, because of the time frame here, we don't get into it in too much detail. All right, dry matter intake is calculated as an average over the entire grazing season for each type and class of animal. And, so again, you're going to be, just like how most people are doing now with the organic systems plan and breaking things up according to class and type. So you have lactating dairy cows, you have dry dairy cows, you have, bred heifers. And then, of course, you have with beef, you have slaughter stock. You have the same things. You have lactating cows, you have dry cows, you have bred heifers, non-bred heifers, So you have these different groups, and you need to break them up by each type and class in order to calculate. And it's very important that you break them up by that, not just do it for the entire herd, because each one of these type and class of animals has a different nutrient requirement. So their dry matter demand is going to be different for each group. Now, I will go in and say that if you do manage within a type and class of animals, say your lactating dairy cows, if you manage them in subgroups, then each subgroup is going to have to meet the requirements. And really by what we mean with that is we're not really looking over the time of the animal moves in from, say, beginning lactation to mid to end. We're more looking at seeing if people are separating them, say, into a high-producing group and a low-producing group. And then they want to, just by the law of average, meet the rules. Okay, that's not going to be allowed because each group that is being managed differently, and the one group will not be being managed to meet the rules. Okay, so again, remember, it's about making sure that you meet the dry matter intake as an average over the entire grazing season, but you have the specific things that you're going to be judged by, meaning are you meeting the 30% for dry matter intake from pasture, and then also are you meeting the no more than 70% from feed. Okay, this slide here is just talking about the exemptions. We've already gone over 2 of the exemptions. The other is breeding bulls and the finishing or slaughter stock. Now here with the livestock feed, this is what producers must describe in the organic systems plan. A lot of this producers are already doing in the organic systems plan. Just here it's just telling you specifically what you need to address so that you make sure you're meeting these requirements in this rule. Now, one thing that has changed from the proposed rule to this one is that it is not as prescriptive. So we're telling you what you must do, and then we're allowing the individual operations and along with their ACAs to decide exactly how you're going to present the information. So the description of the feed ration for each, again, type and class of animal must include all feed produced on the farm, all feed purchased from off-farm sources, the percentage of each type of feed type, including pasture, a list of all supplements and additives, and then you also have to document the amount of each type of feed that was actually fed. And then you also need to document changes that are made to the rations throughout the grazing season. And again, remember the Organic Systems Plan, and I'm going to reiterate this again later. Organic Systems Plan is a plan that you're going to be doing that has to be approved ahead of time, and then you will actually have your on-site farm records, which will basically is the proof that you're meeting your Organic Systems Plan, or will document any of the changes that have occurred that still demonstrates that you're meeting the provisions, but maybe there's been a change because something occurred during the grazing season. And then, of course, you have to provide the method for calculating dry matter demand and dry matter intake. This is one specific area where the proposed rule is very prescriptive and the final rule is not. We're allowing flexibility there. Okay, now I just wanted to get into the section where we jump into what is dry matter demand and intake. Now this is the part where, unfortunately we're not going to have that much time to get into great detail. We are having trainings throughout the country. We've already conducted one. We will be conducting another one in Albany, New York next week, and we have 2 more the rest of in April. And so, of course, we're encouraging people to come to those. But we also have guidance material out on the website. But then also, as Deborah mentioned, we, are partnering with many different groups to also provide help to producers. But what is dry matter? A lot of people are, question, well, why can't we just talk about this in terms of as-fed, or what the animal actually eats? Well, what the animal actually eats, or what is called as-fed, is just that, the amount that the animal consumes per day. The problem with that is that it means the amount, so that's the weight of it, which weight is going to include moisture. And the problem with that is not all feed sources contain the same amount of moisture, so you cannot directly compare the different feeds. So you need to put everything on a dry matter basis, and so it's the amount consumed. So again, it's the amount, but it is on a moisture-free basis. And, this is very important because, again, here's just an example where grain is approximately 89% dry matter. However, grass, depending on the variety, can be anywhere from 20 to 30% dry matter. So it's very important here that you put it on an equal basis so that you can accurately compare the feeds, because the dry matter is actually the content, is the amount of nutrients available to the animal for health and production. So it's the level of intake from a ration that contains the recommended energy concentrate for the animal's stage of life and production. All right, and again, it's very important to put this on a measure that can be equally compared, so it's easier for you to actually calculate. And many people think, oh, it would be much easier to calculate on an as-fed basis, but if you've actually got to compare them, you have to turn them into a dry matter basis. And so, honestly, if we use as-fed, we're stopping you and actually giving you a break by removing one calculation that you'd have to do, because even if you were trying to compare them, you'd have to ultimately turn them back to as-fed, and this intent here is trying to get it directly in to the measure that you can compare. But dry matter intake is a tough subject matter, because it needs to either be actually measured or accurately estimated so that you can get the proper diet formulation. Of course, you want to prevent underfeeding or overfeeding. And then, of course, you want to promote efficient use. The slide jumps ahead of me. Okay. All right, but estimating actual dry matter intake from pasture is a big challenge. Okay, so the issue here is not so much actually measuring, but it's more about accurately estimating, because you have something that's very difficult to actually measure from pasture, so you need to make sure that you can put it into a practical tool that you can use, because unless you're able to go out there and really measure the amount of grass that that animal is intaking, it's going to be very difficult for you to get some kind of actual measurement for dry matter intake. Okay. So, just along with that same line, predicting dry matter intake is not an exact science. It's influenced by many things. It's influenced by the animal itself. And you can see here all the different things about the animal, including body condition, production, level of production, also the size of the animal. All that influences dry matter intake, but also the feed ration, the quality and availability of forage, and the amount and type of supplements. So both the forage will alter dry matter intake, as well as the amount and type of supplements that you are giving. And then, of course, dry matter intake, most of the estimates don't account for the numerous physiological, environmental, and management factors. So again, these are general estimates, but that's what we are allowing. We're allowing that because we know how difficult it is for it to actually be measured. We've got some guidance material out there, and essentially it walks you through the step-by-step procedures on how you're going to determine dry matter intake from pasture. Of course, your first step is going to determine what the demand of the animal is, and you determine that. Then the easiest thing to do, because it's very difficult to measure how much pasture is consumed, you're going to actually go and measure how much dry matter is consumed from feed sources. So with that, you're going to determine the dry matter content of the feed and convert that into a dry matter basis, and then you're going to be able to calculate based on amount. And then through subtraction, you can subtract the amount from feed sources from the dry matter demand, and then that will be your dry matter intake from pasture, and then of course you convert it into a percentage to see if you meet the rule. Again, this is just a snapshot of our website, and you see here the different guidance materials that we have. We actually here have two dry matter demand tables for dairy and beef. This is developed on the National Research Council tables. It's actually condensed down. And then we have the step-by-step here in the calculating dry matter intake. And then we have worksheets out there to help you. We also have a worksheet down here that's going to help you in terms of rotational grazing systems, how you can determine how much pasture you actually need for the demand of your animal. Okay, as I said before, dry matter is calculated as an average over the grazing season. So obviously you're going to need to take an initial dry matter intake calculation, and then you're going to have to take it again. You know, it depends on the operation as to how many times that you're going to take it. The rule of thumb is any time a change is made is when you recalculate. So in other words, if the nutritional requirements of the animal changes, you're going to have to, the diet of the animal is going to change, so you take a measurement. Okay, if something happens to the amount of available forages, then you're going to have to recalculate again because the diet changes. So again, the rule of thumb is when a change occurs, that's when you calculate it. And then you're going to average it over the grazing season. And the next two slides, when they come up, are just show that. Oh, this is just showing you again, you know, that drop off in time. So you're going to calculate it here initially, then you're going to calculate it again here with this drop off, and then you're going to be calculating again at the end. All right, this is a snapshot of our worksheet that we have out there. And again, this is blazing through this, but hopefully you can get some help from your ACA to understand this. But essentially, it's giving you at least 3 slots to take it. Again, you can modify this to as many times as you need. You don't have to measure 3. That's not what we're saying. But this is giving you 3 slots. This is we want you to tell us where you get the value, what the dry matter demand is, and then you're given actually 4 slots for your other feed sources. And then on the next slide, it's going to show you that you come down here and total up your dry matter intake from feed sources, and then through the subtraction method, because the calculations are over here, you can come up with what the pasture dry matter intake is, and ultimately down at the bottom you get a percentage, and then it'll say, do you meet the requirements? So this is just NOP's version. Does not mean you have to use it, but this is just something we have out there for you. Now we're getting into the livestock living conditions. So before we were talking about livestock feed, now we're talking about the living conditions. So as we said, there's multiple steps to this where you have to meet it. And so there's feed requirements. We've talked about that, sufficient quantity and quality of forage. Cannot have more than 30%, or excuse me, cannot have more than 70% from feed, and then you must have at least 30% from pasture, dry matter intake from pasture. So now we're getting to the livestock living conditions, and it's choosing to jump ahead of me. Let's see if we can go back here. And this is the provision where it just clearly states that ruminants must be managed on pasture, and the ruminants must graze daily throughout the grazing season. So again, here's another provision that has to be met. They all work together. They're all not meant to, you're not meant to focus on only one, but through showing and demonstrating that you meet all these different requirements, you'll meet the entire rule. Now the next slide is the part where we are requesting comments, and it is on the ruminant slaughter stock. Specifically, the rule states that they must be maintained on pasture for each day that the finishing period corresponds with the grazing season. However, the rule does exempt the slaughter stock from the 30% dry matter intake during the finishing period. And the finishing period cannot exceed 1/5 the animal's total life, or 120 days, whichever is shorter. I'm going to try to speed up here really quickly because I think we're getting close on time. But if you look here, here's a slide that you can go back and look at. The slaughter cattle, essentially, if you're over 20 months of age, you're going to be going by the rule of thumb of 120 days. And if you're under it, then it's going to be 1/5 the lifespan. And of course, sheep, they're much shorter lifespan in terms of slaughter stock. So of course, they're going to be caught by the 1/5 its lifespan. But this is a specific area that we are asking for comments on. Now, please make sure you do comment, but make sure that your comments do stick to this portion of the rule. And, one of the main reasons is a lot of the comments that we received really focused on the dairy provisions and did not focus on a lot of the beef, especially finish feeding part of it. So there are some specific questions that you can go to the rule that are listed here that you can give comments on. The next slide is just going to tell you where. We have a 60-day comment period and where you can submit them. As always, through regulations.gov, and of course you can send them to our office. I'm going to skip past this really quick, but you can go back for that details in the rule. Now, one of the specific things with this is not only do you have to meet the livestock feed provisions and livestock living conditions, you also have to meet the pasture practice standards. Okay. This is where the producer of an organic livestock operation must, for all ruminant livestock, demonstrate through audible records in the Organic Systems Plan a functioning management plan for pasture. Okay, so again, you got two things there. You're going to be submitting your Organic Systems Plan, and you're going to have now that's going to include a pasture plan, but it has to include audible records. So with that, it's always remembered, and I get to this again at the end, you have your plan. This is your pasture plan. But as we know, weather does not always cooperate. Things happen. You cannot always stick to your pasture plan. So you need to make sure through auditable records that you record them on farm so that you can demonstrate compliance, or especially if there's a major change that occurs that you need to get permission from your certifying agent, you have those records to demonstrate to them. Okay, but pasture must be now managed as a crop. Pasture does not include, or being managed as a crop does not include the rotation provisions. However, if it is an annual crop, then it must be managed in full compliance and will have the rotational provisions. Irrigation, it should be used to promote pasture growth when it is available so that you can extend your grazing season. Okay? Again, the whole point of the pasture compliance is to comply, or pasture standard is to comply with different requirements throughout the rule. Of course, as we discussed, you have to provide sufficient quantity and quality of forage to the ruminant livestock. But then have that so that it supports that your ruminant livestock will receive a minimum of 30% of their dry matter intake from pasture. Of course, you want to minimize the occurrence and spread of diseases and parasites and refrain from putting soil or water quality at risk. A pasture plan must be included in with your Organic Systems Plan. We've already stated that. And it must be updated annually. Now, if no change occurs to the pasture plan, then you can resubmit the previous year's pasture plan. However, we all know, like I just said, weather is always fickle, and we always know that there's going to be events that occur throughout the rest of the year that can gauge, that you can use and gauge what your grazing season will be like. So, you really do need to reevaluate your pasture plan and make sure no change has occurred, because this year is a good example of where this year's grazing season is going to be probably very different from last year's grazing season because of the harsh winter. Not only was it very harsh, but it also went for a really long time. So that's going to alter maybe when available forage starts coming in for your livestock. So that's just one example how if you did have a pasture plan, how it would change from last year to this year. And the point is you want to predict as accurate as you can what the grazing season will be. But again, if you predict something and of course something happens and a change occurs, and it's a large change that maybe affects your compliance, you need to make sure you go to your ACA before implementing and make sure that it is approved. Okay, with the pasture practice standard, there are specific things that need to be included. Of course, number one, the type of pasture provided. Number two, the cultural management practices, so that you can ensure sufficient quantity and quality of forage, and of course, ensure the 30% DMI from grazing. The pasture practice plan also must include the grazing season, so you need to tell in the pasture practice plan what the grazing season is for your operations regional location. Again, very specific to the geographic location and to operation. Although, you know, one thing may be different for a neighbor down the road versus your operation, you know, granted during peak grazing season when no major weather events are occurring, you know, those systems might be very similar, but we all know one operation to the next, depending on the type of soil and the type of land they have, they can have varying and different grazing seasons. So it is very independent of each operation. So just work with any specialist around your area to make sure it's defined correctly. Okay, location and size of pastures, of course, including maps. And then you also need to talk about the types of grazing methods to be used. Now, keeping in mind, what you also need to get into the description with this is what animals will you use on each type of grazing method. You know, for example, you know, lactating dairy cows are going to have a higher dry matter demand. You're probably going to use more of a rotational grazing system for them. However, you know, your replacement heifers that are bred, they may be on a continuous pasture. So you also want to specify in there because that can also control your compliance to the rule. And then, of course, location of types of fences and shade and sources of water. And ultimately, you also want to show the soil fertility and seeding systems and how erosion control is done and protection of the natural wetlands and riparian areas. So ultimately, this is your pasture plan. See, a lot of people hear the term quality management system. This is your quality management system for your operation with regards to pasture. It's your documented plan. Of course, I put the terms contingency plan in there. That's just saying, you know, you might want to include in it what you, it's not required, but what you might want to do in case something happens. But then, so you have that plan, and you have to demonstrate all the requirements in that plan. But again, that's just a prediction or a plan of what's going to occur on site. You need to have the supportive records so that you can show that you've stuck to your plan and or show any deviations. However, you, of course, you'll show that you still are in compliance with the rules. And then this, of course, will be used for your on-site inspection. So your ACAs are going to be seeing the rest, but your on-site inspection is also going to be looking at those records and then giving back a report to the ACA for a final decision. Now, I have this kind of, it's really the final slide up here, because we really want to emphasize with this, there's just not one part of this. We do find that most people are tending to only focus on the 30% dry matter intake part. But remember, it's all about the whole entire picture. Okay, so if you do not, so say on paper, you can show that you meet the requirements. But if you get and actually look on farm and look at your pasture management plan and actually what you're doing with your pasture management, if that doesn't support the amount of dry matter intake, then you're still not going to meet the rule just because you have it on paper that you meet the rule. So in other words, you need to demonstrate on paper as well as in your operation management plan an actual, you know, operation. I'm not just talking about on paper, that you are meeting these. So of course, you're going to go through the grazing season, built on the grazing season. Is going to be your calculations, but also all other feed requirements. Then you're going to be demonstrating sufficient quality and quantity of pasture through your organic systems plan. On site, you're going to see how much available forage is really there. And then, of course, you have to meet all the other provisions within Part 205 that are applicable. So, again, it's a big picture, and you want to make sure that you're meeting all. Now, like I said, that was a very, very quick run-through of this, and we did not get into detail. At our training sessions, we actually get in a lot more detail because we spend a lot more time on the rule. We kind of spend the morning time on the rule and get more in depth. We actually give more examples of dry matter intake, how to calculate it, give a lot of the resources. And so we encourage anyone who can, of course, to go to any of our trainings. We've already had one, but we have another one coming up next week, as I mentioned before. And then we have one in Denver on April 7th and one in California on April 26th. So we encourage you to come. Also in these training sessions, we have a whole pasture management section. So we're trying to give you as many resources that are out there to help you implement this rule.
Okay, so in closing, we have a few resources we just wanted to pop up on the screen that will provide you with more information on the pasture rule. First and foremost, it's not up there. Please contact your certifier, your local certifier. Some have and or will be having some training on this, and so they're your first contact. And as as Kerry mentioned and we've talked about before, there's the National Organic Program website, and you just want to see the pasture rulemaking information. There's a link right on the right-hand side of the NOP landing page. So you want to take a look there. I also wanted to mention that organizations like the Northeast Organic Dairy Producers Alliance and other local farmer and farmer advocacy groups are also providing great resources on the rules, so make sure to check those out. And then finally, you can check out eOrganic. This webinar will be posted, the archive of this webinar will be posted on our public site at that email or that web address that you see there. That's www.eextension.org/organic_production. Kerry, thank you so much for presenting for us, and as well as your staff.